This is part 8 of Entity Framework tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss using stored procedures to perform insert, update, and delete operations using Entity Framework code first approach. Let's look at the steps involved. First, create an empty ASP.NET Web Application project and install Entity Framework if it's not already installed. Let's add a class file to this project and let's call this employee.cs. This employee class is going to contain 4 properties: ID, name, gender, and salary. To speed things up, I have already typed the required code. The next step is to add another class file, and let's call this employee dbcontext.cs. This employee dbcontext class is going to inherit from dbcontext class, which is present in system.data.entity namespace. So let's go ahead and bring that in as well, and make the employee dbcontext class inherit from dbcontext class. This class is going to contain a public property which is going to return a db set of employee objects, and let's call this property employees, and let's have the get and set accessors. And this class is also going to override the method that's present in the dbcontext class. To find out what are all the methods that are available for overriding, simply type the override keyword and then press the space bar. We are going to override this onModelCreating method. Now this is where we tell the Entity Framework to use stored procedures, and the way we do that is we use this parameter that's coming into this method, modelBuilder dot entity of employee. So with this employee entity, anytime we insert, edit, update, or delete an employee, we want to use stored procedures, and we tell that using this method, map to stored procedures. So basically we are telling map this employee entity to use stored procedures. Okay, alright, and to this project we are going to add another class file, and let's call this employee repository. And this file is going to contain the methods to select employees, insert, update, and delete employees. Okay, so first of all, within the at the class level, let's create an object of type employee dbcontext, and then this is going to have a public method, and this is going to return list of employee objects, and let's call this get employees. And the employee dbContext object has got the employees property, which is going to return a db set of employee objects. Let's convert that to list and return the list of employees. Pretty straightforward method. Now we're going to have a method to insert an employee, so this is not going to return anything. Let's call this insert employee, and obviously we need to provide it with the employee object that we want to insert, and we are going to use the employee dbContext object, which has got employees property, and to that employees collection add the employee object that is coming into this method as a parameter, and then invoke employee dbContext objects save changes method, which is actually going to save the changes to the database. Similarly, we are going to have update employee method, which again is not going to return anything. Let's call this update employee. And here what we are going to do is, first of all, find the object that you want to update. So employees dot first or default, so we are using some link methods here. So x such that x.id. So what we are doing here is, within the employees collection, retrieve the employee object that we want to update. And this object which is coming into this update method is going to contain whatever changes we have made, maybe using the UI. So what we are going to do is we are going to take the employee ID of that object, match it with the object that is present in the employees list, and obviously this first or default method is going to return an employee object which we actually want to update. So let us store it in a variable of type employee, and let's call this employee to update. So that's the employee object that we want to update. And what you need to do here is obviously set all the properties. So employee to update dot name equals employee dot name. Similarly, set gender and salary properties as well. Employee to update dot gender equals employee dot gender, and finally employee to update dot salary equals employee dot salary, and then simply call employee db context dot save changes, which is going to save the changes to the database. Similarly, we are going to have a delete method. So again, to the delete method we are passing the employee object that we want to delete, and then let's call this employee to delete. So from the list of employees, retrieve the employee object that matches with the ID of the employee object that we want to delete. And then what we are going to do is we have the employee db context dot employees dot remove the employee that we want to delete, and call employee db context dot save changes. So pretty straightforward methods there. Okay, all right. Within the web.config file, we need to add a connection string to our database. And to speed things up, again, I have typed this connection string, so let me copy that and paste it within the connection strings section of the web.config file. So notice that we have named it employee db context, which is similar to this name right here. Okay, and we have the connection string. I'm using local server, database is sample, and I'm going to use integrated security. You can either specify SSPI, or you can simply say integrated security is equal to true, and you will have to provide the provider name, system.data.sql client. Alright, now let's actually flip to SQL Server Management Studio. At the moment, notice that I already have a sample database there, so I'm actually going to delete that. And now let's actually, before we run this project, we need a web form. So let's go ahead and add a web form. And first, let's set the style attribute on the div tag. Let's set font family to Arial. Let's flip this to the design mode. And we need three controls here. First, a grid view control. And we need a details view control and an object data source control. At this point, let's build our solution so that all these classes are compiled. Okay, I think we didn't change the name of the method here, so this has to be delete employee. Alright, so let's build the solution. It should build now successfully. So notice the status bar, build succeeded. Now let's flip to our web form. So first we need to configure our object data source control. So click on configure data source, and here our business object is going to be employee repository. That is the class which contains the methods to select, insert, update, and delete employees. So let's click next. On the select tab, select get employees method. On the update tab, select update employee method. On the insert tab, select insert employee, and on the delete tab, select delete employee, and click finish. So we are done configuring the object data source control. Now let's configure the grid view control. First of all, let's auto format this to use colorful scheme, and then let's set our object data source control, source 1 as the data source control, and we want to enable editing and we want to enable deleting as well. And another important thing that we need to do is set the data key names property of the grid view control. So by default, I mean here ID is going to be the key of the employee table. So we need to tell that to the grid view control, and the way we do that is by using this data key names property. So ID column is going to be the data key. Okay, and yeah, that's it, configuring the grid view control. Now let's configure the details view control. Let's auto format this also to use colorful scheme, and we want to use object data source 1 as the data source control, and here we want to enable inserting. And while we are here, let's also set the default mode of the details view control to insert, and we don't want this ID to be editable, so let's flip to this to the source mode and then set ID insert visible attribute to false. So at this point ID is not, a user cannot provide a value for the ID because that's an identity column. It doesn't make sense to provide a value for it. Okay, so at this point let's go ahead and build our solution, and let's run the project. And notice within SQL Server we don't have the sample database, so when we run this it should actually create the sample database automatically for us. It should also create employees table within the sample database. Along with that, it's also going to create 3 stored procedures for us to insert an employee, delete an employee, and update an employee. Now at the moment the web form doesn't display any data. That's basically because we have a brand new database and employees table within that without any data. That's the reason why we don't see the grid view control. So now if we flip back to SQL Server Management Studio, refresh the databases folder, and notice that we have got sample database. And if we expand that, look at the tables. So there we got employees table, and if we expand that, expand columns, we got ID, name, gender, salary. And if you expand this programmability folder and then expand stored procedures, notice that we have got 3 stored procedures there. And look at the naming convention used. Employee underscore delete. Employee is the name of our entity, right? So to delete an employee we have the stored procedure employee underscore delete. To insert an employee we have employee underscore insert, and to update the employee underscore update. So these stored procedures are also automatically generated. Let's actually look at the text of this employee underscore insert, and to look at the text, use the sp underscore help text and then execute that. So that should bring the stored procedure text. So copy that and paste it right there. And if you look at this, look at this employee underscore insert. Obviously to insert an employee we need name, gender, and salary, and those are being passed in as parameters, and a simple insert query there. And then notice an additional thing that in this insert stored procedure is doing. Now when we insert an employee, it's going to automatically generate the ID column value, which is our identity column. Now the auto generated identity value, look at this, we are retrieving using the scope identity function, and then that is stored in this variable right here. And then finally we are returning that ID value back. Okay, so the insert stored procedure, it should also return the auto-generated identity column value. Okay, and similarly it also has implemented the employee update and employee delete stored procedures. Okay, so now let's go back to Visual Studio, and then at the moment we don't have any data within the table, so let's quickly execute the select query, select star from employees. So the table at the moment is empty. Let's actually execute this SQL script to insert some sample data into it. And let's refresh this web form. So now we should get the data. So we have the data grid view is displaying. Now let's actually fire up SQL Profiler. And we want to run a trace, so click that and click edit, and let's change mark name to mark M. Look at this, at the moment ID field is also editable. If you don't want that to be editable, simply set the read only attribute of that column to true. So let's update this. Look at that, it has got updated. Now if we go back and if we look at right here. Look at this, employee update is called, and look at that, ID value, name value, gender, and salary value, all of them are passed. So it's now using that employee underscore update stored procedure. Similarly, let's try to delete an employee. So employee is deleted. Now let's go back here. It should have used employee underscore delete. Look at that, it has passed the parameter for ID, parameter value for at ID parameter. Similarly, let's insert maybe another employee. Let's call Stacy, female, and 60,000 is the salary. So look at that, that record is inserted, and if we look at SQL Profiler, it should have called employee underscore insert. And if you don't want this ID to be editable, simply within the web form, in the grid view control, we should have an ID bound field. There we go. Simply set that read only attribute to true. Run this, and when we edit it, now ID column is not editable. Alright, so it's that easy to use stored procedures with entity framework code first approach. So basically the method that we have overridden, that is on model creating, this is where we tell the entity framework to use stored procedures, and these are the stored procedures that the entity framework has automatically generated for us. Look at the naming convention, very important. Okay, alright, that's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.